Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Margaret, Anton, and Dr. Bethany. Teachman and I are thrilled to welcome everyone to our panel discussion on successfully navigating joint academic industry grant applications. We're very fortunate to have doctors Nick Allen, Derrick Hull, Katrina Roundfield, and Maggie Sweeny here with us today to share their deep expertise and experience on obtaining this kind of grant funding or being part of the funding agencies. So we will jump right in and we will make sure to save 10 minutes or so at the end for your Q&A. So if questions come up throughout, please drop them in the Q&A and we will get to them when we are ready for that section. But before we jump in, I'll pass it to Dr. Teachman to share a little bit about the Thriving Youth in a Digital Environment project that is so graciously sponsoring us today.
Thank you so much. Just want to thank everybody for joining today, and a huge thank you to our fabulous panelists in advance for the wisdom that they're about to share. This is part of a newly launched webinar series through the University of Virginia's Thriving Youth in a Digital Environment. It's a new initiative at the university that's designed to increase research capacity to address sort of two key related questions. The first is sort of recognizing that youth are developing in a digital context, and we need to understand better what the impacts of that are. And then secondarily, to ask, how can we leverage that? So if youth are developing in this digital context, how is it that we can use technologies to help increase access to care and help to address the sort of mental health challenges that folks are facing right now? So we encourage you to check out our website at tyde.virginia.edu and get involved. There's lots of new activities that are happening. But foundational, we think, to sort of making progress in this space is recognizing that we need to have really effective partnerships between academia and industry, and all of the folks on the panel today have are really living that in really impressive ways. And so we're excited to have the opportunity to learn from them, and that's why we were excited to gather here today. So with that, I will ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce yourself. If you could note your position, your connection to SBIR grants in particular, and to academic industry research partnerships more broadly. And I'll start with Dr. Roundfield, and we'll popcorn it around.
Hi, I'm Dr. Katrina Roundfield. I am a clinical and community psychologist by training. I currently advise one of the companies that I helped start in the very early days called Two Chairs, a psychotherapy company across the country, but formerly was a co-founder at a company called Appa Health, and that is where I did my SBIR grant. And I am now working on a new startup that I am not yet sharing with everyone. So I will popcorn it over to Derrick.
Awesome. Thanks, Katrina. I'm Derrick Hull, clinical psychologist by training. I'm the clinical officer of an organization called Hero Journey Club, which is appropriate for helping youth thrive in digital environments because we focus on group support in a video game setting, trying to use the bad to deliver some good. I also recently started a position at a company that's looking at large language models and the ways that those may facilitate mental health care in different ways. My connection to SBIR was at a previous organization, though, called Talkspace, where we received SBIR funding to run an RCT investigating the differential effectiveness between message-based care and more traditional telehealth, which was a wonderful project. And what's the other thing? Oh, academic industry research partnerships. I'm all for them. I think they're so important because industry generates so much data, and it's an awesome opportunity for academics to get involved in that. And it also helps to level up the research that's done at, in an industry setting. At Talkspace, we had 25 some odd partnerships with other academic institutions. It was very enriching, I think, for the service and for the product, and hopefully for the users of the product. And I will popcorn to Nick.
Thank you. My name's Nick Allen. I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Oregon, but I also am the founder and CEO of a startup company called Ksana Health. So my experience of academic industry partnerships, I'm sort of straddling every side of the fence right now, I think, because our company holds a couple of SBIR grants, SBIR fast track grants. Both of them are in phase 2 now. And we have partnerships with academic partners there. I've also been an academic partner. I've done some work with Google and other industry partnerships, and I've also served on the review committee for SBIRs and STTRs a couple of times. So I've seen it from that side too. And I will popcorn to Maggie. Do you need a popcorn? I think.
Sure. My name is Maggie Sweeny, and I'm a program officer at the National Institute of Mental Health, where I oversee a portfolio of grants for our small business research program, including industry academic partnership.
Awesome. Thank you all. We are so lucky to have you all and your expertise to share with us. Maggie, we were hoping you could kick us off by sharing a little bit more about the SBIR funding mechanism, including what are the goals and different phases or mechanisms for SBIRs.
Wonderful. I'm happy to do that and very pleased to be here to talk about these opportunities. So I'll just introduce this from a large scale overview, because I know people are coming at it with different levels of familiarity. But as I mentioned before, I'm a program officer at the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH, which is part of the larger National Institutes of Health, or NIH. And NIH supports awards where small businesses can apply for research grants to support the development and testing of innovative technologies that have the potential to succeed commercially, and if successful, would provide societal benefits aligned with our institute's public health mission. So as industry academic partners, you can work with small businesses to consider whether a tool that you've been developing has public health relevance, such as to substance use or mental health, and identify the relevant institute or center, such as the National Institute on Drug Abuse or the National Institute of Mental Health. In all cases, the research and development grants are awarded to the small business. However, strategic partnerships with academic investigators and inventors are allowed and encouraged if it benefits the scientific rigor of the research and if it accelerates the dissemination of really impactful academic inventions. And these partnerships are allowed under our Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR program, and they're required for our Small Business Technology Transfer Research Program, or STTR program. So I'm just kind of giving you the acronyms to try to facilitate your own independent search on these. And once you identify what institute or center is relevant to the product that you're developing, I recommend reviewing their strategic plan and reaching out to a program officer, such as myself, to figure out how your product might align with our institute priorities. At NIMH specifically, our mission is to transform the understanding of and treatment of mental illness through basic and clinical research, paving the way for prevention, recovery, and cure. And specifically with respect to technology development with small businesses, our priorities include neurotechnologies that improve functional measurement and visualization of the central nervous system, development of biomarkers that can provide objective measurement of subjective function through clinical assays or other composite measures. And of course, I'm in the Division of Services and Intervention Research, so we're very interested in interventions that target improved clinical function, such as digital health interventions. Our Division of Translational Research also is very interested in drug discovery and development. And with respect to digital health interventions, these could include products that assess, treat, or prevent mental illness or enhance mental health service delivery. So we have a notice of special interest that if anyone's interested, you can reach out to me and I can share that information with you about our high priority areas for digital mental health innovations. And we also have an HIV research program that would support products at the intersection of HIV and the central nervous system. So overall, NIH sets aside more than $1 billion annually from its research and development funding programs dedicated to support small businesses. And at the National Institute of Mental Health, this translates to more than $50 million per year that can go to small businesses. The individual awards vary according to need and where the technology is at in its development, but it's typically capped at $300,000 or so for a phase 1 project. And those kinds of projects focus on feasibility, technical merit, and commercial potential. And the budgets for a phase 2 project are capped at approximately $2 million. And these projects tend to be larger in scale and continue that research and development effort on the way to commercialization. I should note, though, that if appropriately justified, we're allowed to consider funding awards over these budget limitations on specific topic areas. And that applies to both the Small Business Innovation Research Program and the Technology Transfer Research Program. So you should consider applying for the appropriate phase for your project, given the stage of development. And in addition to applying directly for a standalone phase 1 or a phase 2 project, you could also apply for a fast track project, which includes both phase 1 and phase 2 details in a single peer-reviewed application to try to streamline the progress moving forward. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions about our programs and priorities and look forward to speaking with you more.
Thanks so much, Maggie. That was a really, really helpful overview. We know that building academic and industry partnerships can be sometimes a bit of a black box or hard to know where to get started. So we'd love to hear from you all on how you found your academic or industry partner. Derrick, if it's okay, I'll start with you.
Oh, sure. Gosh. Black box is definitely the right word. When we started looking into this in 2010, 2011, we didn't know what else to do. So we did what we were trained to do, which is you start with a lit review, right? So we went to literature, who's publishing in this space, who has done work in digital mental health. We're also looking for partners who met a couple criteria that were important for us. So one, as I mentioned, we wanted them publishing in the space so they'd be familiar with the kind of work that we were doing. We're also looking for individuals who had recent productivity, because sometimes people publish papers and then move on to other stages of their career. So we wanted somebody who was actively interested in doing research. And then the third criteria that was the hardest to meet, but also the most important, is they had to be willing to talk to me. So if I had reached out to them and heard back, then great, we could have a conversation and we can continue to move forward. And then once we kind of, started talking to a couple potential partners, the work for us from there was really just to work hard to try to construct a data set that folks would be interested in, that didn't have too much data incompleteness, that would be usable for academic purposes. And then happily, once we started working with some partners, then word of mouth was very helpful for us. There were other, they knew other researchers that were interested in the same data set, but had different questions. And so we would sit down and start discussing different projects and ideas together. But it took, I don't know how many folks on the call are from industry looking into this, but it takes some time. You want to give it, I would say, 6 to 12 months at least to start establishing productive partnerships is about where we landed.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one? All right, then I'll lead us into our next question, which is, if you were to think about sort of a key recommendation you would offer, and a key thing to avoid in sort of establishing an academic industry partnership and applying for an SBIR grant, what comes to mind is sort of top on the list? Nick, can I start with you?
Sure. So I think one thing is to understand that you have to think about IP differently than you do in typical academic. So I come from, I'm a kind of a lifelong academic, so I have that background. And in academia, we tend to be, I think most people are pretty open with their ideas, with their methodologies. They kind of want to disseminate them and have other people use them. When you are forming a partnership around SBIR, then, part of the reason you're getting funded is to, develop a product that will be commercially successful. And so that means there are potential IP issues where the dynamics are a bit different than they might be in a pure academic collaboration. And so let me emphasize, I think these things are quite tractable. I'm not suggesting that they're impossible to deal with, but it's just a different way of thinking. And sometimes our academic partners have been like, oh, so if we let you use this, in this product, and then that becomes a thing that you want to sell, then we need a whole tech transfer process around that. We need to come to an understanding of, who owns what and how it can be used, and what happens if someone starts to make money, and then what, all that kind of thing. So I think that's one issue that is a real difference between academic and industry. And the other thing that I would say is just the pace of change. So, for example, we're doing a randomized clinical trial now with an academic partner where they're using one of our software products, and they're like, well, good RCT design says that you need to do the same thing for everybody. And we're like, but yeah, we're not going to sit on this product and not change it for 3 years. That's not an option, right? So there has to be some understanding of the differences between the dynamics in business versus the dynamics in academia. And so, and it's not just that, the fact that things typically move a bit slower in academia than they do in business, but also the fact that sometimes what's considered good design by certain sort of gold standard measures is just not practical from a business point of view. There's a couple of thoughts.
Wonderful. Katrina, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, a couple thoughts I had in addition to what Nick was mentioning was, I think, just breaking this down to 3 key recommendations I have. One is to start early, and starting early will help tee up the other 2. But I think starting early, really thinking about where you are in the life cycle of your company, really thinking about what's the most leverage that this type of a grant can give you, and really getting organized about that is very important. Which leads into the second piece in terms of starting early is really assembling a very exceptional team. And again, starting with point 1, really thinking about who do you need on that team, where are the gaps? And so to give context here, where we were awarded the SBIR grant, we got a direct to phase 2 grant of $2 million. And it was, essentially I was the co-founder of this company. And so as researcher and co-founder, and I had to think about what are the gaps in my ability, right? I'm the chief clinical officer, I'm the co-founder. It's probably unrealistic for me to run the company and also do all of the RCT, like day-to-day work. So I'll probably need a program manager. I'll probably need a good methodologist to, complement my skill set. And so we assembled a wonderful team at the University of Washington to support us there and kind of carry out some of the gaps that would be complementary to my abilities. And then the last piece, I would say, again, all coming back to starting early, get feedback and really make sure that you're talking to the right people to make sure that it's a very good proposal. We talked to Maggie, who was our PO. We talked to Maggie and Adam Haim very, very, very early on, and they really helped us think about what's the right track we should select. Is it a phase 1? Is it a phase 2? Is it a fast track? Those are pretty critical questions. And also we got, we received very good feedback about the actual research questions and what would be kind of most valuable for us to uncover in this RCT that we were putting together in our proposal. So those are a few of my recommendations.
Super helpful. Maggie or Derrick, did you want to add anything?
Gosh, it'd be hard to add. Those are some excellent comments. I really appreciate, I'll just highlight maybe one thing that both Nick and Katrina said. So on the life cycle of the company, I think is essential. I mean, in a way, SBIRs are a bit of a conundrum because they take several years to unfold at it, but they're also designed for small businesses. So that's when the business doesn't even know what it is, and it's still trying to figure out what should we be. And so I really appreciated Katrina's comment about planning ahead and trying to find a project that's going to be in some part of the company where you don't expect things to evolve too rapidly in the next couple of years. So that's why, like, for example, at Talkspace, there were a variety of things we could have applied for an SBIR for, but we knew that we wanted to investigate the impact of message-based care, and that wasn't going to change for at least a 6 to 7 year horizon. So we focused the project there, as opposed to, say, on some kind of machine learning project or something else that would likely evolve more rapidly. The other thing that I would share, and of course you would need to discuss this in partnership with your academic partner, but leaning into this idea that software platforms do change relatively rapidly is you don't want to collect your outcome measures on the platform itself, I think, as a general rule. It's much better to allow the research partners to do that through REDCap or whatever their preferred method is, so that the way that they're collecting data is not going to be impacted by new version updates or your system going down or what have you, to try to streamline that. We did have, I won't share too much about the mistake, but we did make one mistake where we relied on the Talkspace platform to collect data, and we lost a couple months worth. It was not great. So, want to use tried and true data collection methods. And, again, REDCap is great. Qualtrics is fine. There's a variety of them out there. That would be another thing I would say to avoid. And then the last thing I might say is, if you can, try to finish the project before you go public, if you are with a company that goes public, because navigating an SBIR and everything that goes along with an IPO is, it's not great for all involved. So be aware. Although if the time's right, go for it, but just be ready for a lot of extra work. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. You all have touched on some of this a little bit, but we're curious, like, what have you learned from being an SBIR applicant, reviewer, or awardee that you wish you had understood earlier in the process? Nick, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, well, I've done all of those things. I've been an applicant many more times than I've been successful. I've been successful a couple of times, and I've also been a reviewer. I think one of the things that was very interesting for me in all of those processes is that if you think that it's easier to get SBIRs than regular NIH grants, you might be surprised. And the reason is because you have this kind of double jeopardy. The scientists will still, there are scientists on the panel, and they will still judge the science just as harshly as they would for any other kind of NIH application. And then you've got the industry people there who are looking for, the go-to-market strategy and the commercialization and the product market fit and all those sorts of things. And if you don't, and so that's what I mean by the double jeopardy, is that you've actually got to hit both of those marks pretty well to get funded. So, and I haven't seen any evidence that, like, for example, that the science is less rigorously reviewed than they are for the grants that academics might be used to applying for from organizations like NIH or NSF. So I think that's something to be aware of, that you've really got to hit those two marks well. They're not easy to get. I don't know if Maggie can confirm this or not. I have the impression that the pay line is a little lower for SBIR, by which I mean that the proportion of applications that get funded might be a little higher. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's an impression I have. So in that sense, there might be a little bit of advantage, but yeah, you do have to hit both of those goals, and you will get reviewed rigorously on both of them.
Maggie, do you want to comment on the sort of where those funding lines are?
Well, I'll first just really concur with what you said, Nick, about the challenges of addressing both of those two areas. I think it is, as you said, it's not intractable, and there are strategies that people can do to make sure that they cover both of those bases. But it is, I think, an important recommendation is to make sure that when you're preparing your application, you pay equal attention to the scientific rigor as well as the commercialization. And that's where it comes back to Katrina's point about the expertise on the team and making sure you all have expertise and roles and responsibility that contribute to both of those elements. I think that will help both in terms of application and the peer review element, because reviewers will comment both on the commercial potential and the scientific rigor, as well as in practice, the very practical elements of who's responsible for what and how do you advance both the company goals and the scientific questions. We do publish all of our funding rates online, and it's actually separated out by small business innovation research relative to regular grants. So it does change over time, but I would say overall the funding rate is is challenging for both. But you can certainly take a look and look at that.
Derrick or Katrina, anything you'd like to add?
I'm sure we both have all kinds of wonderful stories to share. Two more that come to mind for me are that I learned is that, I think there's a sense on both sides, that business is skeptical of academics and academics are skeptical of business. Unless you get two people in one, like with Nick, I suppose. I'm not sure how he has the split personality thing. But we found it was helpful to lean into that a little bit because it improves the project. To Katrina's point earlier, like getting feedback is so helpful because in business, we've always got our like rose-colored glasses on and everything's going to go wonderful and this is going to work for everybody all the time and we're going to change the world. And it's nice to have some informed data from like, what are the base rates that your service is actually competing against that are already well established in the literature, right? And academics know that really, really well. And I think, on the academic side, at least I heard from many of the partners that we worked with that it was fun for them to see this research sort of continue to live beyond the paper in some way, because it's this living, breathing service in the world. And so I wouldn't let that skepticism on either side, tarnish the partnerships. I think could be very, very productive when it's leaned into and appreciated as a feature, not a bug of the process. The other thing I would mention for those that are here from industry is be prepared for the paperwork early and often. There's more paperwork than you think there's going to be. You want to track where everything's going. Now, typically, you won't have a single audit until you're receiving $750,000 or more a year in funding. But I think it's just helpful to behave as if you are, because at any point it could still happen. And I think when we first began, especially when we secured 2 other grants and we did hit that limit, it was a lot of rework to go back and track everything the way that it needed to be. So I wouldn't want to scare anybody off either. I'm not saying that the paperwork is onerous to the point to where this isn't worth it, but you do want to be prepared and make sure you have an accountant that's keeping an eye on what's happening and that everything's being documented appropriately.
I think the only thing I would add, I would echo all of those points from Nick and Derrick and Maggie. And I think the only thing I would probably add is just that in a startup, change is the one constant. And there's just so many different changes that come up. And I think this, I'll have more to say on this probably in a couple of other questions that come up. But just making sure that as you think about the life cycle of your company, where anticipating where those changes are going to be. And like, there's just so many little decisions that you need to think about and make as you think about if this potential product line changes, like what does that mean for the research? Or if this particular way that we're collecting data changes, like to the point of REDCap. Thankfully, we only use REDCap through University of Washington. It was wonderful. We didn't have any complications with some of those issues, but there are just a lot of different changes that you want to think through, and we can get more specific about that as we go on. But I think just kind of making sure that you consider those potential changes and then think through how that would affect your SBIR if any of those potential changes might come up.
That's actually a perfect lead in, I think, to the next question. So maybe I'll start with you, Katrina, and then hear from others. I guess that one of the things I think that can be really challenging for folks is to figure out, like, how do you know when you're ready to apply for this type of funding? So you talked about like thinking about the life cycle of your company. You talked about like, start early in the process. And at the same time, like needing to have that really like well-established team, needing to have the capacity to do the paperwork and all of those pieces that Derrick pointed to. Like there's a lot of pieces that need to be in place for this to be successful, to write a good commercialization plan, all of those parts. So can you talk about for each of you kind of how you've known like this is the right time to go for it? And then Maggie, your advice as on the funder side on that. So I'll start with Katrina.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'll say what we did well starting out, which was, we had already launched the product. We were already actually in market. So everyone has a different probably story on how they approached this. So I'll just share what we did well, which was, we had already tested the product out. We had been partnering with some folks at UCSF to test the product. We had outcomes. We had a paper that was under review in collaboration with UCSF and the Johns Hopkins. So we had some preliminary data that we knew that the product was most likely working well. So I think that's first, like, at least for the funding mechanism that we went for, which was a direct to phase 2, we needed to know that it was working. And so that was one de-risked place that we started. And then the other piece was that we were in market. So to the two, the two sides, right? The double jeopardy, as Nick said, like, there's the outcomes and the research, like, is this product viable? Is it working? Does it deliver health outcomes? Is there actual traction there? And then we also had commercial traction on the other side, which was we had a signed contract with a school district that we were rolling our product out to as mentorship, plus kind of a digital tool that went along with that mentoring service. And so we already had a signed contract, paid customer, school district that we were rolling it out to. And I think those two things combined put us in a good position to push forward with a stronger grant application. And so I think that was a big part of it. And I think the last piece that I'll say is that our team was pretty well established. Like, we had really strong, deep-rooted connections with UCSF, with the University of Washington. We actually had a grant that we successfully secured, an NIH impact grant that we secured prior to getting our SBIR grant, and it was with our partners at the University of Washington. So it felt like a very natural next step to take the work that we'd already been doing with the University of Washington and then turn it into a larger impact grant with the SBIR. So those were, I think, a few key things that we did well in evaluating the life cycle and the appropriateness.
Nick, do you want to join in and share kind of what your experiences have been?
In terms of how did we know we were ready, I get, that's an interesting question. I think, how do we know we were ready? It's like, I just apply for grants. Like, it's part of what I do. So I think it came up as an idea fairly quickly in the life cycle of our company. And also I have a lot of established academic collaborations so in this respect, I might be a little bit unusual. So I already had in place quite a network of academic collaborations, and I already had a lot of experience applying for NIH funding. So putting those together, we, pretty quickly started thinking about, well, do we have an idea here? Who could we work with? And we started doing that. And so it felt very much similar to the kinds of academic research grants I'd applied for. I think that perhaps something I'll say about it is relates to the issues that Maggie was talking about where you apply straight to phase 2, whether it's a phase 1 only or whether it's a fast track. Because I think this relates to the readiness question. So it's important to know that phase 1 can be actually quite preliminary. And you can really take, if you're just applying for phase 1, you can have a prototype or very, very early, not even an MVP sometimes, you can and you can get funded to do things like user-centered design, understand product market fit, and do customer discovery work and, all these sorts of things that are quite early on in the process. So don't think like you've got to have a full working product or you've got to be in market to apply at that stage. Obviously, in Katrina's situation, she was applying for her group was applying straight to phase 2, where you do need some of that stuff in place, I think. And then, of course, there's the fast track, which has the appeal of being like you're getting phase 1 and phase 2 funded. The caveat that I would mention there is that you've got to write the phase 1 and phase 2 application in the same length. So you've got to fit the science into the same box that you would put in for a straight to phase 2. And so there's a trick to doing a good job of describing both phase 1 and phase 2 within a more concentrated format. So I think that it can be the right time at various stages of a company's development, but it's about looking at the appropriate mechanism across those for where you are at the time. But I do think that but beyond that, the things that are about when are you ready, it's all the fundamentals. Do you have a good question? Do you have a good methodology? Do you have a good team? All that kind of stuff. If you feel like you can tick some of those boxes, then then go for it. And the other thing, the final thing I'll say is that anyone who applies for grants knows that you don't get most of the grants you apply for, and you usually have to apply multiple times. So in other words, in some ways, there's no harm in just getting into it, you know, because the sooner you start, the sooner you'll get the feedback, the sooner you'll learn, the sooner you'll improve your grant, and the sooner you'll get funded. Because it's almost certainly not going to happen the first time. If it does, you're very lucky, and good luck to you. But that's not true for most of us. And so knowing that the sooner you kind of get in there and get involved and start to get the feedback, the better off you are.
That's great. Maggie, you give people advice on this all the time. Would love to hear sort of, you know, your rules of thumb and particularly like where you see people kind of most going wrong in this space, where you're like, oh, you weren't ready. That was a lot of work. That was a bit of wasted time for you kind of thing.
Yes, I will say before starting that I do agree with Nick about that. This is how you get the feedback is by, you know, starting with the application and submitting the application. But it is true that it's a lot of effort to build these teams and to prepare for this. So it's worth asking, you know, where you're at. Now, the technologies that we support are so varied that it's hard to say there's not a one size fits all for when you're ready to apply. But I think you know, what can be just a very practical rule is to start to put words on paper. And when you get, you know, your concept paper or a specific aims page, I think you'll start to learn about, are you prepared to articulate both a strong scientific rationale for what you're doing as well as the commercial potential. For That's for the application itself. Now, when it comes to phase one, we do support products very early in development. It really is focusing on feasibility, technical merit, and commercial potential. So it can be not developed. It can be additional refinement, the sorts of user-centered design that Nick was referring to. It can be maybe very preliminary clinical pilot data where you're preparing for a larger clinical trial in phase two, which might make sense if you're developing a clinical technology. I agree with the need for pilot data for a direct to phase two, and there are some strategic advantages to the phase one and phase two combined fast track application in that you would not go back for, if successful, you would not go back for additional peer review in between phase one and phase two. So it's streamlined, fast track. But if you're not prepared to articulate in great detail the methods that you propose to do for phase two, if you don't have all of your design considerations worked out, if you don't have all of your strategic partnerships like clinical partnerships or other commercialization partners that you're developing, then you might not be ready for the phase two or the fast track application. And another component of these applications that differs from typical NIH grants is that you have a commercialization plan. And the commercialization plan goes into detail about the competitors in the marketplace and your unique strategies for why you'll be successful. And that's only required for phase two and fast track applications. So if you feel like you need more time to develop a concrete commercialization plan, phase one might be a better fit.
I would also say, like, having been an unsuccessful applicant and then been a reviewer, say yes to being a reviewer for these grants. It will make you so much better at writing them, because those conversations, being part of those conversations, understanding what issues arise and seeing a pile of them is just so useful even for your own writing on it.
Thank you all. So we've talked a lot about the SBIR funding mechanism, and it's clear that sometimes it's not the right fit, but it's still very important to do academic industry partnerships and research together. So we're curious if you're aware of additional funding mechanisms or ways to start to build these partnerships and get that work off the ground. Katrina, I'm curious, it sounded like you've had some experience doing this outside of this funding. Would you mind starting us off?
Sure. We, so as I had mentioned, there was an NIH impact grant, I believe that was what it was called, that one of our industry or our academic partners was able to leverage. And that's where we did quite a bit of user-centered design testing to better understand our products. So that was very helpful. I mean, I'll also just mention, I'm in the world of industry at this point, and there's venture capital, which is a whole other conversation. But I think that is actually probably the most common way that this is done, is that people just go to venture capitalists and say that we need funding for, to test the quality of the product, and that's a whole other. We should have a different panel on that discussion, but I think that's typically how that is done outside of academic. Or more kind of traditional research grants.
Oh, sorry, Nick.
Oh, I was just going to say, one funder that I've done some work with that I know is very interested in this space is the Wellcome Trust in the UK. So some people may know they have a call out right now, although I think it's due in a couple of weeks, so might be a bit late if you're seeing it for the first time. But nevertheless, I was a consultant on a report that they did about catalytic environments for digital mental health products, and the point is that they're very interested in not only how do we get the research done, but also how do we create sustainable products and sustainable business models that can actually drive innovation in healthcare. And so that's one that I'm aware of. I'd be glad to be told I'm wrong, but I'm not sure there's an equivalent in the US, certainly not in terms of size, because the Wellcome's a very big funder in the UK, and they will do global funding, but they tend to like there to be a lower and middle income component to the work that they support. So they may not be as keen on something that's based in the US. I'm not sure.
I know that I'm coming from one specific funder standpoint, but something that might be a useful resource to consider is working with your university's technology transfer office. A lot of times they have resources available to help you think through these different options, whether it be a specific NIH application or whether they have other, you go through the other small business programs, such as through the National Science Foundation. And we also, there are small business development centers local to each state that are meant to be there to support small businesses. So again, that's not necessarily large grant funding, but to help get you prepared to be competitive for both the investors as well as the research and development.
Yeah, a lot of great sources. A couple others that I might add. This is actually related to how do you know when you're ready to apply for funding, is if you know the difference between the requirements for an STTR funding mechanism versus an SBIR funding mechanism, you might be ready. We made the mistake of applying under STTR to begin with, and we're told that we don't meet the requirements for that, and then we had to reapply to an SBIR mechanism. But there are companies out there that do meet the requirements for an STTR mechanism, so that's an additional one to SBIR. They're very similar. Though subtly different. As I said, would be good to talk to somebody like Maggie probably before you run headlong into it. To Nick's point about the Wellcome Trust, we have seen increase there. One challenge I've seen with the Wellcome as a funding mechanism is that their indirects are sometimes a little bit less than some American universities are looking for. So you'll want to talk to your research partners about that before you put in a lot of time applying to Wellcome.
So 15% cap on indirects.
It's what?
It's a 15% cap on indirects. I happen to know that in case anyone cares.
Yeah, there you go. That's very valuable information. Somebody write that down. So you want to talk to your research partners on that. Having received funding through a couple different mechanisms, I have to say my favorite are just the regular old R01 funding mechanisms. They're great. Because universities have a legion of people who take care of, remember the paperwork I mentioned before? That happens on the university side. Now you're a sub-award and as an industry partner, they're awesome. Love R01 funding mechanisms. They're a little harder to get, but they can be attractive. Maggie mentioned the NSF. We've seen, what the NSF funding, of course, is generally less than what NIMH will provide. Sometimes by an order of magnitude. But if you are interested in doing like health economics research, the NSF has lots of open calls for that kind of research in particular. They don't fund clinical trials, but they do a lot of health economics. The other two that I'll mention are, there are some, some of the Fortune 5 that will fund these partnerships. I know Google has provided funding to study certain kinds of mechanisms. Again, it's not a lot, but it's something to get a project off the ground, especially if you're early. Now, to Nick's point much earlier about IP control, you definitely want to be very thoughtful before you take funding from Google about that. Google is very, how should one put it? They have a lot of eyes on who controls the IP at the end, so you'll want to keep track of that. And then the other one I'll mention, I haven't received funding from, but is meant, I've heard quite a bit about, is PCORI. I can't, for the life of me, couldn't tell you what PCORI stands for. But PCORI is another funding mechanism that I know some folks have gone after that might be worth jotting down.
These are great suggestions. Thank you. Can I hear from the group about, so let's say you get really lucky and you do get that funding, then you actually have to do the work that you propose to do. And so would love to hear people's thoughts about how you can best sustain the partnership once you get funding, and sort of what are the challenges and lessons learned. People often talk about like there being different incentive structures and things that you need to sort of produce, and markers of, what allows for promotion within an academic environment is different than what allows for promotion within an industry environment. So Katrina, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I'd say the first thing, and I would be remiss not to just acknowledge, I had the most incredible project manager, and she was, I would say, sustaining the project was really just made easier by having incredible organization from my project manager that we did end up hiring, and wrote that person into the grant to hire them. But that there's multiple sites, there's like an entire company running, there's research running, there's, we're in Oakland, California, they're in Washington State. There's just a lot of moving pieces. And again, the one constant is change in a startup. So there's just a lot of change and change management to kind of manage. I think what we did really well was really keep a lot of the change siloed from the research, and it, what changes did come up, we kind of streamlined in a way that made the research still feel on the rails and not get derailed by that change. So for example, we had changes to our commercialization in, during our project. So there were different changes about how we were commercializing and how we were going to market. And I think that impacted like some aspects of like how we recruited the participants, because we had to go through different channels. But for the most part, it didn't, significantly derail like the actual execution of that research, which I think was important. So I think sustaining those partnerships, like hire very well always. That's just a business principle, but hire very well, and also really stay hyper organized around managing a lot of the changes that are inevitable in the startup. And I think the other piece, just as you kind of mentioned, Bethany, is just making sure that all folks across the partnerships are just kind of aligned on like, where does this research sit? Like, what is the value of this research for the business? Because I think those priorities often change in the course of the business, because the business might say, this is great, we needed the funding, this is going to be important. And then other, things change, and there's a different massive fire happening at the business, and they aren't as interested in what's happening with the research. And so I think really just keeping, open communication about what are the priorities of the business? How is the research still aligning? Are there any changes we need to make sure that this research is still fitting with the priorities of the business, and keeping the lines of communication across those partners really strong.
Other suggestions people want to make about how you sustain those relationships, or things you wish you had done looking back?
So many regrets. No. So one thing that I'll flesh out, certainly on our end, that Katrina alluded to, is buy-in from leadership. I mean, ideally, this was the case, for us, and I'm sure it was for Katrina as well as a co-founder. Ideally, your PI is also an executive, so that they are in those leadership meetings all the time, conveying the benefits of the research. Because businesses are very like the next shiny thing. And when you have a 4 to 5 year grant horizon, you can't be chasing shiny things all the time. You want to be able to sustain the grant. So I think that's very, very important. A good program manager. Somebody should highlight that, like underline it. If we had a bad one, I don't know what we would have done. The projects would have completely crashed. So you need somebody who's very strong in that position. Pay them whatever they want. You want somebody who knows what they're doing there and will take care of it. Otherwise, hazards will follow. The other thing that we ran into, if there are research objectives that rely on software development at the company, be very, very careful with how you communicate timelines to the rest of your partners. In fact, what I started doing is I would get a timeline from the software developers, and then I would add about a month just to make sure that they have time to finish, QA, have everything. Because we did have a couple times where we just sort of passed the timeline along. And so then the research partner's like, okay, well, this is going to happen. We need to gear up our side of the team. And then it's like, oh, sorry, we have a delay. Oh, we have a delay. So I think managing timelines is very important. We met weekly with our research partners. We just had standing meetings every week, because sometimes you don't, again, if the research partners don't have background in business and the business side doesn't have a background in academia, you may not be sensitive to what the other side's going to care about. And the only way to surface that is to meet often, even if you don't think you have to, just to kind of give updates. And the next thing you know, I'm giving an update that I don't actually think is that big of a deal. And the research partner's like, okay, we need to really pay attention to that, or that's going to have this kind of impact. So, learning to speak each other's language and staying in constant contact, over communicating, as is often said, I think is valuable here.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. We are ready to move into our questions from the audience. The first question we have, Nick and Derrick, you both mentioned IP. We're curious about how you protect IP as a business when you have an academic partnership. What are some tips or tricks for ensuring that you have that shored up before entering into these relationships?
So IP takes many forms. So this is not going to be an easy question to answer at a high level. I guess some of the key, okay, so simple things, you should establish a non-disclosure agreement but between the partners if there's a business involved. The university, legal office will be very slow with that, and so that'll be frustrating. But it's important to get it in place. I think that then you have to understand who's bringing IP and what is it, and what IP is being generated. So this is where it gets tricky, because there's a lot of different ways. So you could have an academic partner who's bringing some IP. It could be, most IP from academic partners is not patented in our field. It'd be different in engineering and some areas of medicine. But if there is a patent, you definitely need to know about it and be very mindful of that. But in terms of protecting the company IP, I think you just have to be really clear about what you're bringing, who, in what way has it been transformed through the process, and how is that, and who is contributing to that, and what claims might they make because of that process, and therefore anticipating that early on. So one of the things people who don't work at universities might not understand is that if you work at a university owns everything you think. Right. And so in my case, when I spun my company out of the university got to sell my ideas back to me as part of the tech transfer process. Right. So just to know that when an academic is doing academic work on an academic salary, if you have an intellectual product, the university most universities will assert IP ownership over that. And so that means that as a company, you're now working with the University Tech Transfer Office, not with your academic partner. And the academic partner might be, oh, that's fine. No, go ahead and use it. All good ideas should just go around. And the Tech Transfer Office, who will be, the university leadership will be saying to them, like, why aren't we MIT? Why aren't we Stanford? Why don't we have all these huge, payoffs from our intellectual properties? They're getting a lot of pressure to squeeze every bit of commercial value they can out of the university IP. So look, I could talk about this for hours, but I think the bottom line is think about it as carefully and thoroughly as you can, as early as you can, have the right conversations, and know that it might be there are going to be other players potentially other than just your academic collaborator. The university itself will have a role here potentially, and you need to be mindful of that.
The only thing I'd quickly add, I mean, that's perfect, is that, as I mentioned before, we established, and not all of these partnerships were funded, but we established, some 24, 25 different academic partnerships. Do not expect every university to handle this the same way. There's actually a surprising amount of variance in how universities respond to this issue. And so certainly don't have it in your head that once this legal exercise is done once with one university, it will play out the same way with another, because it generally doesn't. So you want to start early and often with each partnership that you're pursuing on that legal exercise.
These are fantastic suggestions. I know there's so much more to say on this, and we'll be sending a survey at the end for people to say if there's other topics they want, to get more supports on. I think we could have honestly a whole webinar on just on the sort of like IP piece of this, which would be actually fascinating. Keep sending in the phenomenal questions here. I'm going to quickly raise one for Maggie, which is a question about how people can work best with you. So what is it that, as a PO, you wish people were coming to you at what point? Questions you wish they were asking you? What's the best way to take advantage of your expertise?
Sure thing. I appreciate the question. And I think the most important thing is if you're meeting with me, that's a step in the right direction. So you're already halfway there. But I recommend reaching out with an NIH style specific aims page, or just a concept paper in which you're describing the rationale, methods, and goals for your project. And we'll use that to guide our discussion to help you get more specific feedback and help me, see things that I recognize might come up in peer review or with respect to our program priorities. And I would say the sooner, the earlier in the process, the better. At least a couple of months before your deadline, hopefully you have a pretty concrete idea of where you're going, but it's okay to revise this, and it's expected that your ideas will evolve. So we won't sort of hold that as the definite thing you'll submit. But if your question is, should I go ahead and reach out before submission or don't, it's too close to the deadline, just go ahead and reach out. And I'd be happy to meet with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We had a question. So increasingly, industry companies have their own internal research expertise. I'm curious, from your perspective, how important is it to establish an academic partnership to obtain this kind of funding? And, what are the benefits of using external expertise that may be duplicative to what you have at the company?
That's a great question, and it does vary according to the company and what the expertise that they have in-house. So it's certainly not required to have an academic partnership to have a successful small business innovation research grant. That is, we've mentioned these two different programs, SBIR and STTR. It's not required for SBIR, which is the larger program. It can be challenging, though, with getting all of the appropriate expertise in-house, especially with a smaller end of the small business. So it can be very beneficial to try to get the small business expertise within the company, and then having the scientific and perhaps clinical trials research experience outside in an academic setting. But it certainly, we have had many successful applications who don't have those partnerships. But I would say look at the content of what you're proposing to do and expect reviewers to look at the methods and the scientific and clinical knowledge, and be going through each member of your team to see if those boxes are checked. So I definitely recommend considering academic partnerships as one way that you could build that.
We are just, oh, sorry, Derrick, did you want to add?
Real quick, just one sentence, which is another advantage to having an academic partnership is that it will elevate the research that you're disseminating. And it also allows the company to have an independent evaluation of the service that they're providing, which I think wins big with large payers and other kinds of accounts that companies want to work with. So that's that last thing I would say.
Well, thank you all. We are at time. I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for attending, and a huge thank you to Nick, Katrina, Maggie, and Derrick for their time and expertise today. I know I learned a ton from this, and I'm sure our attendees did as well. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and being willing to talk to us today.
Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it.